Welcome and thank you for joining part 3 of Seyfarth's Transportation and Logistics micro webinar series, Managing Labor Concerns in the Transportation and Logistics Industries. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature located on the right side of your WebEx window. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down. It will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the presentation. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to our first presenter, Jack Lambremont.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Jack Lambremont, and I'm a partner in Seyfarth's Atlanta office, specializing in labor relations and labor law. I've been practicing in this space for over 20 years, and my practice, as well as the practice of my co-presenter, John Telford, focuses very heavily in the transportation and logistics industry. I've done work in warehousing and distribution, international express delivery, maritime, airlines, and various other areas. And one thing I can say with certainty is that although we treat it as an industry, the players have very different needs and concerns, regulatory schemes, and other things that can impact your business. So there's no real homogeneous way to approach most of the issues that affect the quote-unquote industry. For that reason, we're going to do a fairly high-level hit on a number of issues of interest under labor law, and with an eye towards trying to make sure that they are tailored to the industry as a whole and segments of it in particular. The first thing we're going to talk about on the next slide is some trends in what's going on in union organizing. There's certainly been recently a lot of press and news about what appears to be a reinvigorated labor movement in the United States. Under the Biden administration, obviously, we have a labor-friendly National Labor Relations Board. We have a labor-friendly National Labor Relations Board General Counsel. We have, obviously, some press going on about organizing in certain sectors, heavily in retail. Starbucks seems to be getting a lot of press these days about all the activity that's taking place there. So the question is labor really having a moment, or are we kind of just seeing a blip or a spike in activity that may not be indicative of any broader change? What you can see here on this slide is that unions are winning a lot of elections. So from 2021 to 2022, we had an increase in union election wins from 764 in 2021 to 1,196 in 2022. That is the most wins in union elections in a single year since 2005, so obviously noteworthy. The number of wins in 2022, in fact, is more than the total number of elections filed in 3 of the past 5 years. So we're seeing a lot of activity at the Labor Board, a lot of petitions being processed and going to election. Importantly, we are still seeing a very high percentage on the union win rate, 76%. That's a very substantial number. It basically means that if you are faced with an election petition and you did not see it coming, chances are you're behind the 8 ball and the union is very likely to win that vote. That's up from the historic norm of around 50% back in the 1980s. So we're seeing an increase in filing coupled with an increase in win rates, which means obviously an increase in union membership. Interestingly, as we've come off of the pandemic and some of the factors that impacted working, job availability, although of course in the transportation logistics industry, I think many of us on this call saw that we continued to work as essential workers and kept our operations flowing full speed. But as we've ramped back up, the hiring that's gone back on non-union sectors has outpaced the hiring in union sectors. So union membership has actually dropped as a percentage, although the overall numbers of union participation are up. So the number of elections is way up, but one thing that we need to keep in mind, and we've seen it in the press, is that there's been a great deal of activity at Starbucks. And Starbucks, in fact, has had 280 stores organized in recent years. So, when we look at the number of elections and petitions and so forth, we need to factor in that there is a specific employer that has been under assault at a very high rate of speed that definitely impacts those outcomes. We've got 75,000 new union members in 2022 as a result of those union election wins. That is actually more than the number of union members that were added in 2020 and 2021 combined. On the filing of petitions themselves, not just necessarily election win rates, a couple of unions have been particularly active, right? The SEIU, which is not a huge player in the transportation and logistics space, they've increased their number of petitions by 5 times from 2021 to 2022. The UFCW has more than doubled the number of petitions, probably of interest to some folks on this call. But other legacy unions, the Teamsters, the machinists, the operating engineers, the communication workers, have stayed relatively stagnant on the number of petitions filed by those unions. So what does this really tell us? Not a whole lot. We see a real feeding frenzy with Starbucks and in retail, and that's driving some of these numbers up. It doesn't necessarily translate to an increase in petitions in the transportation and logistics sector. So on our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about how people are feeling about unions. So late last year, Gallup conducted a poll to try to determine what the general sentiment in the American population is about labor unions. And a little bit surprising, at least to me, maybe not as I reflect on the data, is that the public approval of labor unions is at the highest levels it's been in recent years. 71% of Americans approve of labor unions. So you don't need to go back that far. As recently as 2010, only 48% in similar polling expressed a positive view of labor unions. So certainly something has changed in the way that people are viewing organized labor as a force for good, maybe as a force for social justice, maybe as a component of all of those things that have been happening more broadly in society. But whatever it is, people have a much more positive view of unions today than they did 10, 12 years ago. But what's interesting, and maybe not surprising, is that employee engagement is higher among non-union workers based on the same polling. In fact, only 27% of unionized workers who responded to the polling said that they were engaged in their jobs, compared to 33% of employees in non-union settings who said that they felt engaged in their jobs with their employers. On the other side of the coin, 24% of union responders said that they were actively disengaged, meaning that they had animus towards their employer, real job dissatisfaction, or felt, undervalued or underutilized or otherwise dissatisfied with their job. So that was 24% of union respondents compared to only 17% of non-union respondents. So while people, and 40% of union respondents said that their union membership was a very important element of their job. So we're seeing an overall trend up in terms of public perception of unions. We're not seeing a kind of concomitant increase in job satisfaction or engagement among people who are represented by unions. Again, that may or may not come as a surprise to folks on this call. If you look at the chart from Gallup here, you'll see that as far back, just in the last 10 years, this thing was way down. We're looking at a trend that we haven't seen this type of public approval since the 1960s. So that's what the public is looking at. Let's look at what's happening with strike activity on our next slide. So for a long time, as the status shows from Bloomberg, strike activity was going down and consistently going down over years with some small blips along the way. Last year, we had a real increase in strike activity here. And some of that could be based on the fact that we're bringing people back to work and things are happening in that regard, and the workforce is increasing. But also, again, we're seeing a huge number of strikes aimed at, and these could be walkouts, one-day job actions, and small things like that, aimed at retailers like Starbucks. And in fact, Starbucks had 107 walkouts during the last year, which definitely contributes in large part to the numbers we're seeing on this increase in strike activity. What is interesting, though, is that these strikes seem to be happening in the context of organizing and not necessarily in the context of contract negotiations. And one data point that kind of supports that is that the number of employer lockouts, which is usually kind of pegged to the number of strikes, they will increase at the same time that strikes do, even though lockouts are less common. There were only 3 lockouts reported in the last year. So the strike activity seems to be part of organizing activism, employees trying to show their employer that they're serious about it, and taking action to try to leverage the organizing activity in the workplace. And again, largely driven by this phenomenon that we're seeing with the SEIU and with Starbucks. Now, whether that is going to translate into additional strike activity in connection with what's going on at the bargaining table, I'll turn that over to John to speak to on the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And certainly we did see last year a fairly sort of aggressive, certainly building into next year, aggressive approach by unions, sort of willing to threaten strikes and, of course, participate in strikes. And certainly sort of the largest one that got most attention is the Deere strike, middle of last year, that resulted in some pretty incredible wage increases and benefit increases. I think that the one sort of thing we have seen throughout last year is that the shortages and sort of worker shortages in the transportation industry, added to the increase in inflation, resulted in certainly higher settlements for the CBAs. You know, when you look at the chart here, it sort of had the low of about 4% back in 2008. Actually, a high in 2008 of 4%, dipping down to sort of 1% increases in 2011, and then with last year, first year increases when you factor in bonuses, up to 6.3%. So I think a lot of that was worker shortages combined with inflation, and then also with a sort of more militant attitude, and unions being much more less reluctant to threaten and actually engage in strike activity. On the one hand, as you were sort of talking about in organizing, we have a lot of both homegrown unions that are not affiliated with other sort of traditional unions, or the traditional unions that may be sitting in the background. And then you also have a number of much smaller units. So one of the interesting things we're going to be looking for in 2023 is how are those homegrown unions and smaller units gonna do at the table. I think they're going to have a lot of headwinds. I mean, on the one hand, not kind of having the expertise of knowing how to get a group of employees together and agree to a contract, I think is going to be tough. A lot of the organizing rationale, while partially economic, is sort of built on social justice and other sort of worker voice issues that are very difficult to translate into collective bargaining obligations and actual sort of language in a contract. So I think everyone's looking to see if the smaller homegrown unions are going to really be able to get to yes and actually have a deal, or is it they just want to have the voice of complaint? So we're certainly looking at that, and I think that will have both an impact on the settlements, but also have an impact on whether or not the continuation of organizing will happen. Because without a deal, at some point, you need to get a deal in order to be able to sort of keep those promises you've made to employees of why you wanted to get unionized. If you look on the next slide, we are definitely expecting, outside of the smaller unions, we've got a number of very large bargaining units that are going to be up for negotiations this year. The earliest in the coming months, Caterpillar is going to be open for expiration. There's some discussion around that, sort of looking at what happened with John Deere, whether or not the unions are going to be very strong looking for a strike there, and how that CBA is going to settle will be interesting. Obviously, the largest group that's on everyone's agenda is UPS, which we'll talk about here in a second, and then all of the car manufacturers are all also up next year. So it looks like, and that'll be sort of more late in the summer, in August, those contracts expire. So we're certainly looking for a lot of activity under collective bargaining, and it's going to be interesting to sort of see what happens, in the face of a continued inflationary environment, but with what most people would concede probably either in a recession or about to be in a recession. How are those two things going to sort of fit together to find out whether or not you can reach an agreement? As early as just a couple of days ago, UPS announced, that even coming into these negotiations, they're going to be doing layoffs in certain geography, certainly in New York and some other locations. So even in the face of record profits. So I think that'll be set up to to be an interesting thing for 2023. The UPS contract, I think, is going to set the tone. That contract expires on July 31st, and the Teamsters have made it clear that they won't give an extension. They have a long list of demands, certainly significant wage increases, a reduction in overtime. They want to prohibit driver-facing cameras, which is an important issue in our industry. The elimination of two-tiered combination drivers. So they had, with the 7-day work week in terms of delivering to their customers, they had created a second combination driver who could do that on straight time, and the Teamsters have promised to eliminate that. Those negotiations started this month. In terms of the local negotiations, and the national negotiations will start on April 16th. The rhetoric from the company side is to try to, I think, primarily assure their customers that there won't be a strike, or that they don't expect there to be a strike. And for the first time, used something I had not heard before, which was that they were looking for a win-win-win agreement. And then the CEO was explaining that it would be a win for the employees, a win for the company, but also a win for the Teamsters themselves, which is a unique way of sort of putting the Teamsters outside of just the employees. But it's consistent with the Teamsters' expressed desire to not just deliver on behalf of the UPS employees, but also to have this be their calling card to organize other folks within the industry. So it'll all be coming to a head as we get closer to June, and we're certainly keeping an eye on that. Similar to that in the freight industry, both of the two large freight companies, which represent about 15,000 Teamsters at both Seyfarth, which used to be UPS Freight, was overnight before that, and ABF Freight. Both of those contracts expired June and July. They're set to get to the table, but we've got similar rhetoric from both the General President O'Brien, as well as the Director of the Freight Division, John Murphy, who's also from Boston, stating that they are ready and militant and ready to win a strong national contract for the Teamsters. So I think we're looking for more of the same from last year, but now on a bigger scale in terms of pretty aggressive negotiations.
And it will be, just to chime in, John, it will be interesting to see because, previously, at least in my experience, unions were very careful to talk about their negotiations really with regard to the members that they were representing, the dues payers who were paying them to go to the table and bring home the bacon. And really, even going back to before the general election for the new Teamsters president, during the debates that were happening within the Teamsters, it was made very clear that they were now going to use collective bargaining agreements as an organizing tool. And that is a change, and it requires a change in the way that they talk to their members about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I do think it's interesting, as you pointed out, that UPS is acknowledging the need for a win-win-win contract, that they understand that this negotiation is very much happening in the public square, and that whatever they negotiate will be used by their quote-unquote labor partner, the Teamsters, to go out and try to organize the next big companies. So it does seem to be a change in approach and tactics that requires the Teamsters to talk differently to their members and marshal their resources differently going to the table.
So I think that, Jack, you were going to sort of focus in the next slide on just some of the agenda of the National Labor Relations Board that is affecting our clients here in the transportation industry.
Sure, absolutely. So let's talk about the Labor Board, and we'll cover this in fairly summary fashion, but folks on this call are probably aware right now we have a 4-member out of 5 Labor Board comprised of 3 Democrats. That's McFerrin, Wilcox, and Prouty, and 1 Republican appointee, Kaplan. And we have 1 vacant position because member Ring's term recently expired. We also have a democratically appointed general counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, who is a very active and activist general counsel who views herself as having the privilege of neutrally supporting a pro-worker statute. She has been very busy in her tenure, very much, probably more so than most of her predecessors, in terms of releasing so-called general counsel memos that kind of set the agenda of the agency from a prosecutorial standpoint, identifying issues that they would like to see addressed in later board decisions or rulemaking, typically to overturn or change precedent that arose under the prior administration's labor board. So a lot of what we're talking about right now is still kind of in the general counsel's agenda standpoint versus decisions that have necessarily come down from the NLRB. And employers, I think rightfully sometimes, find themselves in the difficult position of trying to decide, do I need to take steps now to comply with what the general counsel has identified as the direction of the agency, or am I better served to stay the status quo, continue my business practices as they are, and wait for the labor board to issue a ruling, and maybe even further to that, hope that by the time my case gets litigated, it'll be in front of a reconstituted board that will take a different view than anything we're seeing right now. All of those present, I think, unique challenges for employers that are operating in a very political time of the agency. You know, we are seeing more back and forth and change from administration to administration on what used to be fairly settled principles of labor law, and it creates a great deal of confusion for employers to deal with. The other thing that we're seeing here, and it's the second point on the slide, is that the board had been, and I think still remains, very cash-strapped. So, you know, I talked earlier about the volume of cases that are coming on the elections side to the labor board in the last couple of years. We've seen a similar spike in unfair labor practice cases because the two kind of go hand in hand. And the board is at a real deficit in terms of resources and staffing to handle the volume of work that is coming to it. I think fortunately for the board, Congress did approve a $25 million budget infusion at the end of last year that gives the board a little bit of breathing room, although I would say probably not enough to carry out kind of the lofty goals and ambitions that the agency has set for itself. So we are seeing, you know, and I can speak specifically in my experience, we're seeing extended times on processing of matters, including on election petitions, particularly if there are complex issues involved. There's just, I think, a real challenge in terms of personnel to do the blocking and tackling and issuing of decisions and writing of recommendations that the board needs. Nevertheless, the agenda pushes forward, and we're just going to talk about a few things. You know, there are a number of things that are going on that we're not going to go into detail on. For example, the labor board, the general counsel is pushing for more frequent use of so-called 10J injunctions against employers to seek interim relief against employers where there's a potential that they committed an unfair labor practice while the underlying charge is being adjudicated before the agency. We're looking at a push for full interim relief as an alternative to a 10J. So the general counsel is looking for the regions to go out, and when employers are accused of an unfair labor practice that might merit an injunction, to ask the employer to enter into a interim settlement agreement, essentially providing for full relief for the allegations and the charge. For example, bringing back and paying back pay to people that the employer may have lawfully discharged, only to litigate the case through its conclusion and hope that the board ultimately says that they can fire them again. We're seeing dues checkoff, that needs to be extended beyond the expiration of the collective bargaining agreement, taking away an economic weapon of employers during collective bargaining negotiations. But the four that we called out to talk about a little bit more, because I think that they are relevant across all industries and certainly in this one. The employer work rules, right? So we've seen the board's treatment of work rules oscillate wildly between the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration. And early last year, the NLRB invited briefing from interested parties on the Stericycle case to basically query whether or not they should abandon the Boeing analysis that the Trump board enacted for analyzing employer work rules and return to or formulate a new standard for analyzing the lawfulness of work rules. We expect that when that decision comes down, which should be soon, that we'll see a return to what was called the Lutheran Heritage Standard that prevailed under the Obama board. And under that standard, an employer work rule is presumptively unlawful if a reasonable person would construe it as restricting or limiting Section 7 rights. So it puts the onus on the employer then to have to articulate an overriding reason and justification for the rule, and then allows the board to then balance that against the impact on the Section 7 rights. I've had clients ask me whether they should, in the face of this impending decision, look at rewriting or really taking a hard look at their employee handbooks. And honestly, I think most clients that have been around went through this exercise under the Obama board, and there was a lot of work done to scrutinize and, where necessary, revise personnel policies to kind of comply with the standard that existed then. So by no means am I giving anyone a clean bill of health, but I suspect a lot of the hard work has been done, and I don't know a lot of employers that kind of, after the voting decision issued, went back and put in, retrofitted their personnel policies to be more employer friendly during that time. So I don't know whether this will create a seismic change for a lot of employers because, like I said, I think a lot of the work has been done. The second one deals with group meetings or mandatory group meetings in the context of organizing campaigns. So General Counsel Abruzzo issued a General Counsel memo early last year where she took the position that requiring employees to attend meetings during working time for the purpose of having the employer express facts and opinions about union organizing is inherently coercive and destructive of employee rights under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. It has been long settled law that employers do have the right during working time, where people are working at the service of the employer, to require attendance at so-called mandatory meetings, also in the pejorative sense termed often captive audience meetings. So the General Counsel would like to see that precedent upended and those types of meetings ruled unlawful unless the employer makes an affirmative and clear statement that attendance is truly voluntary. One additional piece of this, though, and so that piece, you can kind of understand. If we're calling a meeting and requiring everyone to stop their work and come and sit in a room and listen to us, that's a meeting. We understand it. But Jennifer Abruzzo also says that the same logic applies when a supervisor or manager approaches an employee in the conduct of his or her work and talks to that person during working time about facts about unions or opinions about unionization. That the same coercion exists where the threat of discipline or reprisal would exist in the mind of the employee if they refuse to engage with that supervisor or at least listen to that supervisor's message about unionization. To me, that's a much harder one to police, right? I mean, how do we stop, anyone who's been through an organizing drive understands that engagement is the most important thing, right? To get your supervisors and managers who are capable of carrying the message out to make sure that employees are getting both sides of the issue and understand what's at stake, understand the reality of what it means to be represented by a union. We want to make sure those things are happening. This is going to make it much harder and, frankly, discourage employers from taking those steps. The third one that I want to make sure we hit, because I know we're getting a little low on time, is electronic monitoring of employees. So again, late last year, the General Counsel put out a memo basically stating that any kind of employee surveillance technology, including, for example, things that monitor work rates or things that monitor, geotab in your trucks or dash cams in your trucks or surveillance cameras that are used to mitigate loss. Any of those things are, again, inherently destructive and coercive of Section 7 rights. They would discourage people from engaging in union organizing activity. And under the proposed standard that the General Counsel would like to see the Labor Board adopt, employers would have to demonstrate an overriding business interest to justify that intrusion on Section 7 rights. And then, even if you could articulate that, which means basically you have to say there's no less intrusive way to get the information we need to serve our business purpose, the board would again balance that stated rationale against the nature of the intrusion on employee rights. This puts employers in a tough box. We know in this industry that we use this technology in a lot of areas. I flag it because I don't know if it will become, the board's position or not, but it certainly will put into a serious conflict a lot of practices we currently have and a lot of technology that's on the horizon that helps employers and the transportation and logistics industries monitor productivity and ensure employee safety. I know we've hit the end of our presentation. We have additional slides to talk about. We tried to front load it with the most important information. John, I don't know if there's anything you want to try to cover before we have to sign off for these folks.
So let me just say two things for those folks who do have to drop off. One, apologize that we didn't get to the rest of the slides, but those will be available if you'd like them. Two, the code for CLE is SAM 4330. And then I will also just do two quick things. I'll just give you a quick tease of the other issues that we were going to talk about. First is that the board has engaged in rulemaking to sort of try to codify the former Obama administration, the BFI decision, expanding the joint employer test to sort of return back to indirect control being a sufficient basis to find a joint employer relationship. The rules have the same defect that the prior decision sort of had in terms of not making it clear what those bargaining obligations may be if you are found to be a joint employer. We know that you're going to be jointly liable for unfair labor practices, for example, for your subcontractor, but who's going to bargain over what issues? And quite frankly, the confusion around that is going to make negotiations much more difficult. Frankly, probably to an end of sort of encouraging employers to basically either babysit or engage in fully in the negotiations, and frankly, at that point, maybe no longer subcontract out the work. So we'll be keeping you apprised of when that sort of the rulemaking is finalized, but it looks like it's going to be returned back to BFI under the Obama administration. The other real quick thing is that most of you may be seeing anytime you get, in our case, a letter now from the Office of Labor Management Statistics, a sleepy sort of organization who hasn't been very active with employers until just recently. They are coordinating with NLRB in two ways. One, they're sort of educating employers about their obligations to engage in financial reporting if they engage in either persuader activity, or they also hire someone to provide them with information about unions or employees engaged in protected concerted activity. Secondarily, which we've only seen the last couple of months, anytime an employer is found to have violated 8A1 under the Act, the Office of Labor Management Statistics has taken the position that any money spent committing that unfair labor practice charge also is a reporting requirement. So if you're getting those letters, make sure you talk with counsel, see how you're going to want to respond to those. The reporting requirement comes on an annual basis for the expenditures. And so it's something you've got some time to think about, but it is something new that you probably haven't seen before, that the sort of sleepy agency is sort of awoken and is working hand in hand with the board. The last thing is, this is hard to sort of do in 30 minutes, but if anyone is interested in having us sort of tailor things to your particular company, expand maybe the time on that, on the issues that are important for you, please in the Q&A or send us either an email or in the Q&A section, just let us know that you might be interested in that, and we will certainly get back to you. If there are any questions that were submitted, we'll also get back to you on those as soon as we can. But we really appreciate you spending the time with us here today.
Thank you all.